I can be exhausting to be around. I don't mean that I'm high intensity or a lot of energy or that I'm extroverted, so if you were introverted you might find me a challenge. I mean that I am a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man, which means that I am afforded the ability to be sort of unconscious of the way that my presence and interaction in the world impacts other people around me. Social constructs like gender and race and sexuality are like clothes in this way. If they're designed for us and they fit us well, then we can go through life without ever really noticing them, without having to pay too much attention to how they fit us. But if for whatever reason those constructs don't fit us well, then they chafe against us, they constrict us, and we're forced to be aware of them in a way that other people wouldn't have to be aware. Okay, so what does this have to do with why I'm exhausting to be around? Well, you see, when you've been conditioned to be comfortable in the social roles, the gender, class, sexuality, and racial roles that have been created for you, as I have, and when, in particular, you occupy positions of privilege and power within those array of roles that society presents for us, then it creates what I consider an empathy deficit. Everyone is expected at all times to be able to empathize with me, but I am not expected at all times to be able to empathize with other people. Let me give you one example of how this plays out in my personal life. When I come home from having led worship on Sunday, I get to be just exhausted. I get to flop down on the couch and not be expected to maintain any level of care or concern or energy for the other people around me. My whole family clears and makes way for me to just have an afternoon where I can nap or play video games or read a book or whatever it is that I want to do to restore my energy. And this is a cultural, familial expectation that doesn't even have to be expressed, but just is kind of known and understood in my household. My children and wife have learned to empathize with a very particular kind of experience, the experience of a preacher being exhausted after leading worship. And I can't think of very many examples where my children or my wife are given similar license in our household to just sort of collapse and not need to attend to the needs of anyone else around them for a while. Now, we use that example right there because it's a very common one. Not the particularities of me being a preacher, but the generality of the women and children of a household being expected to empathize with, to relate to, and even to make room for and to pamper a man who comes home exhausted from work. This is based in patriarchal constructions of gender roles whereby the labor of generally men outside the home is valued more than the labor of generally women inside the home. Women and children are all supposed to make way for dad, to get him his slippers and his newspaper and his cigar, to understand how he feels after a day at work, but he's not expected to understand how they feel. There's a whole genre of comedy that's based around this empathy deficit. Just watch any situational comedy about romance or marriage or relationships, or watch a great deal of stand-up by male comedians, and you'll notice that there's this kind of joke that people go back to, that the basic premise of the joke is, gosh, women, aren't they mysterious and difficult to understand? You'll notice that there are comparatively very few jokes about how difficult it is to understand men. There are almost no scenes I can think of in any sitcom where a group of women just sit around and talk about how irrational and incomprehensible the male brain is. If anything, when it comes to making jokes about men, the jokes are all about how simple and obvious men are, how our motivations are so transparent and everyone can always understand what we're thinking. The reason for this is not based in biology or any abiding truth about cisgendered men or women. The reason for this is based in power dynamics. It's about the relative power differential between men and women, broadly speaking, in our culture. You see, when you're trying to communicate with someone, when you're trying to relate to someone, you need empathy in order to be able to move or to influence them. However, if you have power over someone, if in most of your communication with them you could theoretically bring tools of force or violence to bear against them, which would thereby get them to cooperate with you, then you don't need to empathize with them as much. And when you don't need to empathize with them as much, then the capacity for empathy tends to atrophy, and you find yourself in a position of stunted empathy, of an empathy deficit. Conversely, if you're in a subordinate position, then empathy becomes necessary for survival. You have to be constantly evaluating the motivations and emotions of whoever it is that has power over you to ensure that they don't intend violence against you. And it is about violence. This empathy deficit is a form of structural violence that insinuates itself into all of our relationships. But just because I'm talking about structural violence right now doesn't mean it's not a reference to actual physical violence. Husbands are deadly to wives. Power and wealth are deadly to the impoverished and disempowered, and white supremacy is deadly to people of color. And in the context of our struggle for a more just society, this empathy deficit is important to understand, because when I enter into a space where I'm attempting to be in solidarity with the marginalized and oppressed, I can inadvertently find myself placing demands on everyone else around me that they perform emotional labor on my behalf that I'm not even aware that they're performing. Because just like our culture has overvalued work that happens outside the home and undervalued work that happens inside the home, our culture has undervalued emotional labor, the work that's necessary to creating mutual understanding between people. And that undervalued labor has fallen disproportionately on the oppressed, on the marginalized in our society, to the point where people of relative privilege like myself enter into shared spaces and we just shit all over everything. We focus all the attention on ourselves, we center our own experience, we demand that everyone around us be constantly concerned with our feelings, and we are unaware of the way that we treat everyone around us like they're extras in our movie. I, for example, know that I'm starting to behave this way not just when I discover that I've done something inconsiderate, but also when I've just done something that I'm proud of, that I think was good, that I did it, and then I realize that I'm like internally waiting for a reward, a cookie, for someone to recognize what a good boy I am and what a good job I'm doing, even though all I've necessarily done is offer the minimal level of respect and compassion toward another human being. This is why in our culture, even when we're telling a story specifically about people of color experiencing oppression in a white supremacist society, there's still normally a white person in the story somewhere who behaves in a noble fashion so that there's someone in the story that white people can empathize with. So in Hidden Figures, for example, there's the boss character, the character played by Kevin Costner, who comes and knocks the colored women's sign off the bathroom and declares that everyone at NASA pisses the same color, because it was too much for studio executives and writers to believe that white people would be able to empathize with the three central women whose story it was. It's why a young adult novel that has a male protagonist is considered a book for everyone, but a young adult novel that has a female protagonist is considered a girl's book. And publishers have actually said that young boys can't or won't empathize with female protagonists in their stories. It's why the phrase tone policing had to be invented, because when marginalized people express themselves in ways that aren't specifically tailored so that more privileged individuals can hear it, then they get dismissed. They get called irrational, hysterical, shrill, or an angry black woman, all of which are ways of re-marginalizing them again, of pushing them back into a box and refusing to listen, refusing to hear what they have to say. Understanding is hard work. Empathy involves carrying a burden, and if justice or solidarity work is important to you, then it's also important that you begin to understand the emotional labor that is involved. Understand it and also begin to be able to recognize the difference between work that is your own to do versus work that is other people's. And if you're a privileged person like myself, then to recognize that other people have been carrying your water for some time, and it's past time that you picked up the slack. Hey, thanks for watching. If you've gotten all the way to the end of a video about emotional labor and an empathy deficit, then this channel is probably for you, so you should click that subscribe button down below. Or you can even click on the Patreon button if you want to go and become one of my patrons. Help support me make more videos like this, like all of these fine people whose names you see scrolling past the screen right now. I am grateful for you for having taken the time to listen. I'll go do your work. And I'll do mine, obviously. That was implied. I'll do my work too. Keep on doing it.